This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 5, the Cold War outside of Vietnam, with the section the Yom Kippur War. In 1973, 6 short years after the Six-Day War, and smarting over their absolute defeat in the Six-Day War, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel again. This time a surprise attack on Israel's, on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Huge chunks of the Israeli army were not in uniform that day, they were in synagogue that day, and a very powerful Soviet-supplied Arab attack was launched by Syria and by Egypt. In the 6 years since the Six-Day War, the Israelis had grown overconfident. The Egyptians and the Syrians performed much better than they had in the Six-Day War, and for a day or two at the beginning, it looked as if the Arabs might break through and destroy Israel. And that was their stated goal. They wanted to drive the Jews into the sea. They wanted to, and they said it themselves, they wanted to finish Hitler's job. The job that Hitler had started, they were trying to finish. It's been rumored, although it's never been proven, that the Israeli nuclear forces were actually loading up, that the few nuclear bombs that the Israelis had were actually loaded up onto airplanes, ready to be used when the defenses stiffened and the Arab armies were halted. The Israelis have halted the Arab attacks, and now they are looking to counterattack. But the cost of the war, that Israel's a small country, and the war was so violent and so vicious that the Israelis very soon find that they're running out of ammunition. They're running out of fuel, and they're running out of bullets, and so the leader of Israel, Golda Meir, here she is, she's the Israeli Prime Minister, and Israeli Secretary of Defense Moshe Dayan, beg President Nixon for help. This is at the height of Watergate. So Nixon is dealing with Watergate at this point in time. Nixon is dealing with that pressure, and he's also dealing with this American ally desperate for supplies. And Golda Meir tells Nixon that if you don't help us resupply, then we will not win this war. The Arab armies were backed by the Soviet Union. All of the tanks and planes and artillery that the Arabs were using were Soviet-made. So Nixon agreed to resupply the Israelis. An airlift began. And then the Arabs had the same problem. The war was more vicious and violent than they had imagined. So what you all of a sudden had a Cold War flare-up here in the Middle East, that American planes are flying into Israel carrying supplies, and Soviet planes are flying into Cairo and Damascus bringing in supplies. And the Soviet Union and the United States always tried to avoid situations where their militaries were anywhere really close to each other, because young fighter pilots have notoriously happy trigger fingers, and one mistake or a miscommunication or a misidentification could all of a sudden turn the Cold War hot. The Israeli army turned the tide of the war with a daring paratroop raid behind Egyptian lines. They landed behind those Egyptian lines, cut off the Egyptian army from Cairo, and were preparing to attack Cairo itself. That the war was getting a little out of hand for the Soviet Union and the United States, and so the USSR and the US stepped in and forced a ceasefire on the Jews and on the Arabs, on the Israelis and on the Arabs. The long-term consequences of this war were actually very good for everybody involved. The Egyptians had done enough damage to the Israeli army and had done enough excellent fighting on their own that they recovered their honor. Their honor that had been lost in the Six-Day War was recovered. Even though the Israelis at the end, at the ceasefire, had defeated the Egyptian army again, the Egyptian leadership did not really publicize that, and publicized the great successes that they had in the first 2 days. That allows the Egyptians to save face. It allows the Egyptians to be proud of their army, and to be proud of their political leadership. That pride would allow the Egyptians 6 years later to come to the negotiating table in a bold move on the part of the Egyptian Prime Minister Anwar Sadat and on the Israeli Prime Minister, it's Begin, isn't it? Is it Menachem Begin? That'll be in Block 11 anyway. it allows the Egyptians, now that they've recovered their honor, to make a peace treaty with Israel. And the peace treaty that the Egyptians signed with Israel in 1979 is the first peace treaty between Israel and any of its Arab neighbors. But that's 6 years in the future. Because of the Yom Kippur War and the American support for Israel, OPEC embargoed the United States and other supporters of Israel and refused to sell them oil. You know, we talked about this in another section. OPEC raised the price of oil, making the supply that the United States could buy much more expensive. American thermostats were turned down, cars slowed down, and the United States fell into a recession. And here are some pictures of the oil embargo and the results in the United States from it. There's a massive imbalance of trade as gas becomes more and more and more expensive. Americans are importing more and more and more oil, and the price of that oil is going through the roof. It sends the U.S. economy into a recession. There are incredibly long gas lines for weeks and months at a time. That there are, odd, even rationing days that if your license plate ends in, an even number, you can buy gas on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. If your license plate ends in an odd number, it's, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. That the sale of gasoline was limited. That the price of gasoline, now this is in 1973. This is what we're paying today in 2013 dollars. In 1973, that would be the equivalent of $10 a gallon today. In response, this is a shock, an incredible shock to the United States. That is a country very, very used to cheap energy. The U.S. responds, it's known as the energy crisis, and the U.S. responds by setting a national speed limit at 55 miles an hour, passing laws requiring American cars to get better gas mileage. American cars were cool looking, but pretty disastrous in the early 70s. That 30 years of no foreign competition had turned American cars into these big, giant, inefficient gas. A car like this would get 7 or 8 miles to the gallon. Inefficient, broke down easily, could not be maintained because there was no competition. That the great three American car manufacturers got very complacent by the late 60s and early 70s and were pumping out cars that looked pretty cool but did not run well, always needed to be fixed and repaired. That there was a joke that said that Ford was an acronym for Fix or Repair Daily, or Found on Road Dead. And all of a sudden, making their appearance on American streets during the oil crisis are little cars known as Toyota. Obviously, it doesn't look as cool as this American car here, but a Toyota it's Japanese, obviously. It's very well made. It gets good gas mileage. And all of a sudden, the big three automakers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, see their sales start to plummet, which further injures the American economy. OPEC lowered its prices 2 years later in 1975, but the psychological damage in the United States had been done. That the golden age of American automobiles was over. Small cars were in, little fuel-efficient cars were in. America was not this mighty superpower, this mighty economic and political and military colossus was vulnerable to a bunch of, Arab kingdoms and Arab countries that could just manipulate the supply of oil and bring the United States to its knees. And that's what happened in the early 70s. It's another example of, and Vietnam is the biggest one, of a lack of American confidence. That Americans are usually and historically a very optimistic and confident people. The 1970s is a decade where that confidence kind of flies out the window. And the oil embargo is one great example of it.